Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2022, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Intopia and Fable, and our Gold supporters, Barrier Break, TPGI, and UX for the Win. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have any questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag or post them in the YouTube chat for our Q&A at the end of the session. I'm joined by my co-host, Meryl Evans. Over to you, Meryl.
Thank you. So next we have Malcolm Glenn talking about Beyond the Water's Edge, integrating DEI into Earth's external facing work. Over to you, Malcolm.
Well, thank you, Meryl, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in from, I'm sure, all over the world. It's such an honor to be here with you at what is my first ID24, but hopefully not my last one. For those of you who I'm sure have been watching throughout the course of the last day, thank you for your commitment. I think we're kind of getting towards the stretch run, so you're almost there. I know for many of you, you might be in different places in the world, so the sun may be setting. For folks pretty far east of where I am, it might be even the middle of the night. So I'll just say whatever time it is for you, wherever you are, thank you for spending some time with me in the course of this great conference. I suspect if you've tuned in to some of the other chats throughout this day, most of the presenters have come prepared with either a slide deck or some sort of other visual imagery. And it's with that in mind that I say, and when I say this, I'm not sure whether I should be apologizing or whether you should be thanking me because you get a break. But for what it's worth, I am not going to be sharing any slides with you today. So my hope is that over the next 40 or 50 minutes, even though I'll be doing most of the talking, it will at least feel a little bit more like a conversation. And as you hear me talk, and as you hear me touch on points that resonate in some way with you, I would just say that if you hear something that does pique your interest or something that does spur a question in your mind, I welcome the opportunity to respond to what you may be thinking about in the last bit of our time together today. All right, so I'm here today to talk about boundaries. And in particular, what often feels like the artificial boundaries that are constructed between different parts of different organizations focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion work, inclusive design work, or something in between those two. And I'll get into that through the lens of sharing with all of you some of my thoughts on my approach to equity and accessibility and inclusive design. And I want to talk today about how I think we should fundamentally reshape the way we think about our approach to making institutions more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. What that means practically is pushing ourselves beyond the water's edge, hence the title of today's conversation, in order to better integrate principles of equity, not just into an organization's internal work, but its external facing work too. I think this is important. This is not just a nice to have, but I believe it's an imperative to the ongoing growth of our field and as a means of creating the very best outcomes for people from historically excluded backgrounds out in the world. So that's what I want to talk about today. But before I get into all of that, let me just quickly share a bit about who I am. So as you heard, my name is Malcolm Glenn, and I'm the proud CEO of MG Equity Consulting. And it's a firm that I founded that helps organizations of all kinds and sizes. I've worked with Fortune 500 companies to think tanks, to startups, to nonprofits. I work with those organizations to help them embed equity in everything they do, inside and out. We hope organizations really think about many of the concepts I'm going to discuss today, particularly how to align principles that normally sit within a formal DEI function with efforts that bring that work to communities outside of a company's doors too. And I came to this work after having spent many of my early years in my career working internally at various organizations. So for a while, I was working in political consulting and organizing in Washington, D.C., which is where I live now. After that, I was the national director of communications at an education reform organization. And then from there, I got into tech. And I think that underpins a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. For a couple of years, I was a part of Google's communications team. I was leading executive communications for one of the company's senior leaders. And after that, for about 4.5 years, I was a part of Uber's public policy team. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail in just a second. After working in those spaces in early 2020, when it started to become clear just how big the specter of COVID was going to be, I felt like I needed to change course, to devote more of my time and resources to trying to solve at least some of the problems that were starting to be exacerbated by the pandemic. So I left tech, and I did so in order to determine just how I could best help companies from the outside. And that's what I've been focused on for the last couple of years. But this story actually begins, I think, long before 2020. So years before global pandemic, before any of the conversations that I think we've been spending so much time on over the past couple of years, I was actually hired at Uber to manage third-party relationships with issue groups, with advocacy organizations, and nonprofits. And eventually, I became the head of global policy for accessibility in underserved communities at the company. And it was in this role that I pretty soon realized that, yeah, in some ways, we were changing transportation for many of our customers. We were expanding access to an alternative to taxis, which of course have a history of things like destination discrimination and an unwillingness to pick up certain people based upon unfair stereotypes. While we were making some progress, at a core level, our platform was still leaving many people out. And I think to a particularly egregious degree, that was the case with people with disabilities. And so my work at Uber was really focused in part on building relationships with disability advocacy organizations in order to learn where we weren't doing a good job and where we could improve. I wanted to know whether I could take the feedback from the leaders in those advocacy organizations and have that feedback inform how we shifted or adjusted various parts of our products in order to better serve folks from out in various communities. And I did this work from my perch, as I mentioned earlier, on the policy team at Uber. And listen, from a certain perspective, maybe where I was in the organization wasn't the most relevant thing. But I think it actually mattered pretty significantly. My work didn't sit in a formal DEI function. And in fact, in some ways, I felt really siloed from the folks who were working on diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And that felt like both a problem for me, but also a solution in the works. And so what I did was I pushed to integrate my external advocacy with the DEI team's internal work, such that we started measuring success from a diversity perspective based in part on external outcomes. Not just whether we were hiring and growing employees from certain groups, which is something that matters deeply in its own right, but also whether we were growing the adoption and accessibility of our platforms for people from those groups and breaking down the barriers to access as much as we possibly could. Which is to say that having a diversity of people at a company and ideally empowering those people to thrive and grow and help shape the culture of that company is a necessary but insufficient component of DEI work. I believe that in order to make this work as real as it can be, the people from historically excluded backgrounds need to inform the external strategy in order to help everyone get better and to help make these efforts an ongoing point of focus at all sorts of organizations. And there's an example from my time at Uber that helped crystallize for me the importance of this dual internal-external approach. So at Uber, we needed to rethink parts of our platform to better accommodate all sorts of people. Again, with my focus disproportionately on people with disabilities. So we were thoughtful around people who are blind or have low vision, folks who are deaf and hard of hearing. And I think in the most substantive way for wheelchair users, particularly people who use power wheelchairs. In most of those other contexts, thinking about those other groups, making changes could be as simple as changing how the app worked or changing some of our internal policies or what our expectations were from either drivers or riders. But when it came to accommodating people in power wheelchairs, that meant that we had to facilitate access to a different type of vehicle on the platform, a type of vehicle that virtually no Uber drivers were owning and operating themselves. And so I worked alongside an internal team that identified potential suppliers and negotiated partnerships with national suppliers of these wheelchair accessible vehicles, vehicles equipped with a ramp or a lift in order to accommodate a power wheelchair user. And as a result of this work, Uber became one of the leading providers of on-demand rides for wheelchair users all across the world, in a whole host of US cities, as well as places outside the US, like London, Paris, Melbourne, Bangalore, India, and other places too. Now listen, the full story of how that came to fruition is probably longer than we have time to talk through here today. But through my time in some of these corporate spaces, I started to understand that there are things that move the levers for change. And I started to try to apply what I learned, try to understand what most companies really tend to prioritize and how to use that knowledge to leverage the most change for the most people. That knowledge was built over time. And my experience pushing for platform change at Uber wasn't the first time I was working in this space. I actually think that started years earlier when I was at Google. So there, for almost 3 years, as I mentioned, I was the executive communications lead for the company's chief financial officer, as well as his leadership team. And that leadership team encompassed overseeing everything from the traditional finance functions to all the work the company was doing on high-speed fiber internet to all of the company's internal consulting work, including, importantly, Google's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And when I initially joined Google in early 2013, the landscape for DEI work, for inclusive design work more generally, was wildly different than it looks today. Back then, the phrase inclusive design felt like it was a huge rarity in its own right within tech companies. And just as a matter of fact, no major tech company at that point had ever released a diversity report sharing the demographic data of its employee population. And so I worked with our team to get us to the point where we were comfortable releasing our numbers, first internally, just with fellow Google employees, and then a year later to the entire world. And because I was leading much of the communications around the rollout of these numbers, those of which at the time pretty exclusively focused on race and gender within the company, I wanted to make sure that in our communications, it didn't just feel like we were patting ourselves on the back or as if we saw the release of one diversity report as the end of our journey. Because for me, it felt like it was just the very beginning. Because until Google did a whole host of other things, everything from rooting out algorithmic bias in the search function or making sure that photos recognized darker faces just as well as it did lighter ones, things that were not the case at the time, that is, until the outcomes reflected the internal actions, then there was still lots of work to do. And like what I've seen at other companies, like my own experiences at Google, the work on those product teams and the work focused on diversity, these things rarely overlapped. And so I asked myself, what was the point of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts if they didn't translate to better products? That is, what was the point of DEI if it stopped at the water's edge of the internal, instead of embracing inclusive design and the company's impact on the external world? And so I said, I want to help companies answer that question themselves. So I'll draw on my experience to try to influence my own internal stakeholders to listen to the viewpoints of my external ones. And these were the experiences that I had in mind when I left tech to strike out on my own in early 2020. As with many other people around the world, I was trying to do something different at a time that the world was changing. And we all saw what that change looked like in our own experience with the pandemic. But then just a few months later, everything else appeared to change too. Because when people first saw that video of a police officer's knee choking the life out of a man for almost 10 minutes, there was a huge response. And among that response was a change in the rhetoric around how people were discussing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those social justice protests, the ones that followed George Floyd's murder, they made for a truly unique confluence of events and emotions, at least for me personally. For me, watching and participating in those protests was in part heartwarming, inspiring, but also in some ways demoralizing. There was this really rare response that I saw from many organizations in the aftermath of those global demonstrations. And it felt different. I will be the first to admit, it felt like something was happening. These companies were expressing a commitment to make diversity, equity, and inclusion a more meaningful part of the work that they do. Some companies were even making pledges as to how they were going to devote their time, their energy, and their resources to external causes. And at first, I felt great. I felt like this is the progress I've been asking for so long. But unfortunately, many of those company announcements were sadly, and if I'm being honest with myself, unsurprisingly incomplete. In fact, I think most of those commitments felt insufficient. Most of them largely failed to acknowledge that DEI work, whether it's pushing for more inclusion, whether it's creating more environments that welcome more people, that work is irrelevant if it only focuses on internal change. Real equity work, real work that moves the needle, that doesn't stop at the proverbial water's edge. That is, it's insufficient if it only looks at internal processes and programs. The real and the most robust DEI work, where we can break down real barriers to access, doing so at scale, as opposed to doing so just for a small number of folks who happen to work at a small number of companies. That robust work, that has to take into account output. That means how DEI principles are integrated into your products, your services, your policies, and any other external facing materials that you're putting out into the world. Because it's not enough to think about diversity work as an end unto itself, which is unfortunately where I think many of the conversations stop. Instead, this work must be thought of as a means to an end. The end being the delivery of an inclusive output to the host of communities that can benefit, that stand to benefit from an organization's work. And it is my hope that that is something that you can take away from the conversation we're having today, that it's imperative that companies translate that internal equity work into improved access and output. It's imperative that they don't stop just by making inclusion about a small number of relatively privileged people fortunate enough to be offered jobs at those companies. So that's what I want you to take away from today's conversation. But how do you do that tactically? Well, when it comes to making it a reality down on the ground in the organizations where I've worked, I didn't lead with that argument that this was the right thing to do, that connecting to your external communities was how you really fulfilled your promise as an organization. That's not how I led those arguments. The why as to how I was able to get folks to do the right thing was actually less relevant than getting them to do the right thing in the first place. And so I focused a lot more on the what and the how as opposed to the why. And I think again, back to my time at Uber. So we ultimately ended up getting those wheelchair accessible vehicles on our platform, not because I made the most compelling argument about why it was the right thing to do, even though, as I've said, it was the right thing to do. I think we got to where we got through continuously meeting with stakeholders and working to understand their priorities and objectives. Everyone is measured by whether it's objectives and key results or key performance indicators. Everyone's trying to succeed in their career, in their role, and understanding how they were being judged and how they were being measured helped me tie my work to their goals too. I also made the pitch to senior leaders at the company, up to and including the CEO, while working to define and hone that pitch over months and, for being honest, years. And I really enforced the fact that, hey, this is going to make a business impact. And not only is that business impact going to be good for the bottom line, but it's aligned with our company's long-term goals. So just to touch on one example, at Uber, we'd been desperate to build better partnerships with transit agencies around the world. And one of their biggest pain points was that paratransit services historically are extremely costly and difficult to operate, and also slow, and usually they rely on older and sometimes more worn down vehicles. And it made it difficult for folks to get the point-to-point transportation that they were really looking for. And sometimes it meant that users of paratransit had to wait hours just to complete a rather straightforward point A to point B trip. And so it was with that understanding in mind that we responded to a request for a proposal to start a partnership initially in just one city, Boston, to help us alleviate some of the burden of the city's relatively underwhelming paratransit services. With time, and by providing a reliable service for users and helping Boston meet its legal requirements while also saving money, this helped us reshape perceptions of the company's commitment to inclusion, not just internally, but when it came to how people evaluated the platform itself. Through these experiences, I really started to begin to discover the value of taking an external facing approach to equity work. Though, of course, focusing on external work doesn't exist in a vacuum. And it's certainly an abstract conversation to think about companies as doing the right thing or not doing the right thing. Listen, companies don't themselves have identities. Each one is made up of a big or a small group of individuals, different people who agree to a set of strategies and steer the company, which at times can feel like steering a massive ship. They steer that company in whatever direction they think makes the most sense. And it's through having people who are doing that steering, who have a diversity of their own lived experiences, that you can make that case to your colleagues. You need different people on the inside who are constantly pushing for different changes, people with different backgrounds, different experiences upon which you can draw. So you can't make external change without the internal work being a priority. This isn't an either or proposition. You need both as combined pillars of a strategy that support each other and your broader approach or your company's approach to inclusion. Doing this work well doesn't mean treating everyone the same. It means going out of your way to recognize the differences in the ways that people may engage with your products, then seeking out feedback from people out in the real world and making sure that that feedback is reflected in how you're building whatever you're building. Okay, so the way to make this case is by internally pointing out the numerous reasons that this type of work will, as I just mentioned, help the business. These conversations are, for the most part, taking place in corporate structures, where no matter how thoughtful the leadership is, there's still one imperative that rises above all the rest. So what does that mean? That means arguing why it's better for your company when it can reach more customers, when that company can set itself apart from your competitors and develop a brand identity that will engender customer loyalty over the long term in particular. Again, this doesn't mean that it's not the right thing to do. It is, but I just discovered that perhaps that's not the best, most effective argument with which to lead. I think tactically, steering your DEI work towards external outcomes means being an influencer within your culture. I think it means getting the numbers and being confident in the numbers for how many people, how many more people is your inclusive design approach going to reach? How much is it going to expand the pie of customers? How will that work unlock partnerships that might be important for the purposes of future policy fights if you're in a highly regulated industry? Or how is having an active and engaged community that's willing to go out and extol the virtues of your work, how does that limit long-term risk? These are the pitches. These are the arguments that matter and resonate internally. But I think it also means pushing your leaders, pushing them in ways that might make them uncomfortable, building a bench of allies who are going to buy into your efforts, folks who have respect, command respect with folks out in the real world, and also asking the right questions of your other colleagues, right? You need tactical people. You need someone to code the change. You need someone to negotiate the partnership. And you need someone to ultimately lead the team that might be doing the work. And you got to make sure those folks, your other colleagues in other parts of the business, they're bought into. As you're going about this work, It means asking a ton of questions, being a bit of a rabble rouser, and being okay with the fact that that might cause some consternation or uncertainty within parts of the organization. Some of the questions to keep in mind, I think, that will spur action from those colleagues. Are you interrogating? What are the demographics of the team that's tasked with building these products, creating these external outcomes? How are we as a company examining and measuring employee performance? And do we have any metrics, whether those are explicit metrics or perhaps more implicit metrics, that are tied to how well we're doing when it comes to external inclusivity? And how can you develop relationships in order to talk to people out in communities who might be able to help us as an institution understand what we're missing? I don't think the questions stop there. Are you asking, who are the speakers at the panels we're organizing? Who's nominated for awards and who's winning those awards? And are a diversity of communities truly being represented in external images, marketing materials, everything we put out into the world? I think those are some of the questions. I think that's a good place to start, but it doesn't end there. I think it also takes real dedication and ongoing internal advocacy in order to keep this work going. If you yourself are from a historically excluded community, and I certainly have felt over the course of my career as a Black man in largely majority white spaces, that didn't always seem fair, right? Am I the one being tasked with making the change that should have been made before, that makes it doubly hard for me to own up to the stereotypes, to do the work and bring along other communities around the world? Listen, I don't think it's fair that some folks have to bear more of a burden around this work. It shouldn't fall exclusively on the shoulders of people from those communities. But the reality is that it often does. That said, I think there should be work underway to shift that burden. And I think shifting that burden means exposing other people to some of those external communities, helping them hear the arguments for why this work matters, not from you as their colleague, but from a different perspective. And no matter how much exposure you're facilitating, this isn't going to change overnight. Again, companies don't have personalities. They're made up of people, individual people who can change their perspective and can change their tactics. Many of those people, in fact, have really good intentions. But we've talked for decades about good intention. And if we're being honest, I don't think good intentions are enough. The real question is, how do we get these companies to mitigate the harm and actually do good and make sure that underserved communities aren't responsible for that work? So I'm going to close by saying, I think the answer to that question is to look to history. I think the good news is that so many of the problems that companies exist to try to solve that disproportionately impact underserved communities, these problems are not new. That's the good news. The bad news is these problems are not new. Many of these problems are baked into basically every system that exists. And in the country where I live, the United States, and certainly in many other parts of the world, a lot of these efforts, these problems are intentional. They're intentional efforts to discriminate. So one of the other roles I have is as a fellow at New America. And specifically, they have a program called the Future of Land and Housing Program. New America is a think tank based here in DC that studies policy issues all around the world. And in this program, we examine global housing issues and we try to push for equitable policy outcomes. That work is necessary because in so many places around the world, including here in the States, bias and discrimination have been baked into the history of housing for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so I took this perspective. What can history tell me about the problems we need to solve that have thus far gone unsolved? It was with that historical perspective in mind that I looked at the history of transportation during my time back at Uber. Uber, I don't think, was exacerbating issues of transportation inequity, but it was also true that Ubers tended to be more expensive the further away you got from transit in cities. And when you look at the demographics, who's most likely to live in those areas far from transit? I've tried to push myself to really engage with those questions, as well as ones like, what does history tell us about, say, why so many folks from the disability community spent a whole generation chaining themselves to buses to advocate for accessible public transit systems? Transportation in that respect was foundational to the work for so many communities. And so it was incumbent upon me to tie what we were doing today to the history of yesterday. And I think everyone should keep these principles in mind. If you work at an ad tech company, look at the history of racism in advertising, both in the ads themselves, as well as the folks making those ads. Do you work in education? Well, I think it's important for you to understand how discrimination in United States education did not end with the US Supreme Court decision of Brown v. Board of Education. That was one massive fight and an ongoing fight for more equitable outcomes. So connecting with history is one of the ways we can move past just positive intentions and really focus on tying the past to the outcomes of today. I think the more people who have a full-throated understanding of the history, the more likely it is that inclusive design becomes the norm. You know, there's this great saying, I suspect many of you have heard it, nothing about us without us. And I didn't come up with it. I learned about it from some of the work I've done with advocates in the disability community. And I think it's super resonant to this notion of internal and external. For a moment in 2020, as the social justice protests were taking place around the world, it seemed like that nothing about us without us philosophy was going to start to become more the norm, right? How can we engage with these communities to make what we do better? But what we ended up seeing was a lot of performative inclusivity. I think in hindsight, I probably should have tempered my expectations. George Floyd's murder was in some ways a perfect storm. There was this visceral reaction that people had to watching a man be murdered on video. This was on the heels of the deaths of other Black Americans like Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. This was all occurring in the midst of a global pandemic, well before we'd heard of any of these vaccines, when the virus responsible for that pandemic was disproportionately killing people of color. So a lot of companies felt compelled to make statements that they never made before, and that was great. But then as the moment died down, there wasn't as much interrogation from customers, from the media, or from advocates about whether they were squaring those statements with their external actions. I think a lot of those statements were actually not really related to action. And if you look at what they've been doing over the course of the last 2.5 years, have they improved representation? Are they making their products more equitable? What's become of any sort of financial commitments they made around racial justice? I don't think the answers to those questions are particularly great. And I think the truth is, if we left these questions entirely up to the leaders at these companies to answer themselves, we'd be disappointed, right? These things all have a cost in terms of time or money or both. And so the businesses are always going to need a push. I don't ever think we can expect the businesses to do right or the leaders in those businesses to do right on their own. So I think that's where there's a huge opportunity for any current employee at any company who cares about this work, or any advocate out in the world who understands how their community could benefit from improved external output. The employees who push leadership to be better, the advocates who put pressure on those companies to make their actions match their words, that's where the work will continue to be pushed forward. Most companies are really risk averse and they don't want to do things differently than they've done them before. And so it's only when someone is able to help them understand that the risk of inaction becomes greater than the action itself that I think we can start to have real accountability for making sure that those values aren't just lip service. Now listen, sometimes changes don't even happen until there's a regulatory requirement or that the laws force it to happen. That's not ideal, but that is a part of the toolbox as well. But a lot of things in this space, for a lot of people who do this work, are less than ideal. It's not ideal to have to continue to make the case for why people in the real world matter. It's not ideal to have to tie those arguments to a monetary set of implications. And it's not ideal to feel like the marginalized among us are the ones doing the bulk of the work. But it's also not ideal to watch some of the ongoing political backlash against the teaching of our history in US schools. And so I think the work to make what companies do more inclusive is good. It's not just good for the companies. It's not just good for the communities being served, but it's also good for our ongoing ability to engage with the history that helps us understand how we can be better and more inclusive today. So as long as we want to see the change that we know is going to make all of our institutions stronger, it's up to all of us, I think, to be advocates, to be rabble rousers, to be influencers for that change. And that means going beyond the water's edge and making sure that alongside your fight to make your company or institutional culture more equitable, you're leveraging inclusive design to make the communities that you serve or stand to serve more equitable too. And so with that, I know I've talked for a long time, and I certainly want to hear from you if there are things on your mind. I'll just simply say thank you. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your interest in inclusive design. Thank you for everything you've done to make ID24 a reality. And again, this is my first time at the conference, but I hope it won't be my last. You can learn more about the work that I do and some of what I'm up to on my website. It's just www.malcolmglenn.com. And you can also learn more about my firm, MG Equity Consulting, at mgequityconsulting.com as well. So thank you again. I appreciate you so much for being here. And with that, if there are any questions in our remaining time, I'd love to answer them. So thank you so much. And Meryl, I think I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Malcolm. That was fantastic. I learned so much. There were things I didn't know, and I really appreciate you talking about these issues that we don't talk enough about. So we have questions for you. First one, how does a user of power wheelchair request for transportation on Uber? What happens in smaller towns and cities where no power wheelchair enabled transportation is available?
It's a great question. So if you live in a bigger city, it's a lot easier. The experience is just like the experience of requesting an UberX, right? You open up the app and you scroll instead to UberX or Uber Shared or Uber Black, you scroll to Uber Wave, wheelchair accessible vehicle. And the price is the same as an UberX, the experience is the same as an UberX, and hopefully you'll have a very positive experience. But I appreciate that that challenge is much greater in smaller cities. And a lot of how Uber grew is now being seen in how Uber Wave is growing, right? Starts out in the bigger cities, the larger metropolitan areas with higher levels of density, and it expands out from there. I haven't been at Uber for 2.5 years, but when I left the company, I felt like we had made a ton of progress, but we still had a ton of progress to go. And so I think it is incumbent upon people who don't work at Uber, but care deeply about expanding access to accessible transportation to continue to ring the bell, to continue to put the pressure on folks internally at places like Uber and, quite frankly, other institutions that also should be doing more to remind them that we're here, we still want this option, and we know that there are ways to make this option work. There was a theoretical conversation a long time ago. Could we get these vehicles on the platform? The answer was always yes. The company dragged its feet, but now we've seen that the answer can be yes. And so I think it continues to be important that external parties put that pressure on Uber, but also that folks internally who are still at the company continue to make sure that that feedback is getting to the right people to continue to try to push for change. So I know there's lots of work to be done, but I'm hopeful that the continued advocacy will make that work result in better outcomes.
Well, like I always say, progress over perfection.
I love your shirt, Meryl. I think that's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah, it got the accessibility icon in the O. Because if people get so overwhelmed at the thought of accessibility when they're new to it, and they're like, it feels like they have so much to do. So I tell them, hey, cool, it's okay. Just start small. So, everything you do is progress. And sometimes progress goes backward. It happens. But it'll move forward again. That's progress too.
I
So that was
agree.
great.
President Obama used to say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And it's perfectly aligned with progress over perfection. I think that's such a great philosophy to keep in mind.
I like that too. And you mentioned in the talk, nothing about us without us. And some of us are trying to level up and we're saying nothing without us. We drop nothing about us. Because when you should cut it to nothing without us, that's the shirt I was wearing yesterday. So when you make it nothing without us, this means we are in the conversation already because you are already including us. You're putting people with disabilities, people from different races into your company, and they're part of that conversation. Next question. You mentioned a few in your talk, but what are some of the external issues that are more of a focus on inclusive design might be able to help solve?
It's a great question, Meryl. And you're right. In my conversation, I talked a lot about, transportation because my experience at Uber in a lot of ways informs how I think about this work. Some of my experience from Google as well. But there are so many issues where there are companies well positioned to actually start to solve some of those problems if they borrow the phrase that you just so eloquently said, nothing without us, right? Dropping the about us, nothing without us. If you take inclusion as the default, imagine what you might be able to do to think about changing the accessibility of housing. So I mentioned housing. I'm a fellow for New America, their Future of Land and Housing program. We look at all of these housing issues across all different geographies, renters, owners, access in terms of capital, access in terms of how you actually navigate the physical structure. There's a company, Airbnb, one of the biggest global tech companies, has gone public, made a ton of people a lot of money, and is ubiquitous in many, many parts of the world. Imagine what an approach to creating more inclusive housing could look like from a company like that. Think about the barriers to housing that exist all around the world, right? Access to being able to afford them. Folks with certain disabilities not being able to find sufficient supply of accessible housing options that accommodate the disabilities they may have. Looking back historically, we recognize that all sorts of issues related to housing have negatively affected certain people, whether that's redlining here in the United States, where de facto racism essentially said, we're not going to grant home loans to people who we don't like, whether that's people with disabilities, people of color, women, or all sorts of other categorizations. And so I think it's really worth looking at where you work. What is the history of what came in this space long before our company existed? You look back at housing and you learn some lessons that might help you apply some different tactical ways to make housing more important. It's same as I thought about the history of transportation at Uber. There are a lot of companies right now that are involved in workforce development. Let's look at the inequities around how people have had access to work or not over the course of many, many years. And then that starts to bring forth questions that you can start to answer that might help your company approach those issues through a more inclusive lens. So I think it's really about looking back to history, the history of the space in which your company is situated.
Wonderful. Thank you, Don, with the great, thorough answer. So somebody left a comment, and it's not a question, it's a compliment. So does that organization have to do the internal DEI work to be effectively with external faith inclusion? Love it. Thank you for this talk, Malcolm. And I love that comment. But I'm so in agreement. There are so many companies banging the drum that they're doing DEI and they're excelling at it. But I can't tell you how many are totally overlooking just people with disabilities alone a lot. In fact, I just read a job description from a company that's supposed to be good at DEI and accessibility, and it was talking about all the different races and LGBTQ+. There was no people with disabilities in that list. And even California put a law in about underrepresented groups. Guess who was missing again? People with disabilities. So it's a real problem, and hopefully we'll make change. I mean, it's not going to be overnight, obviously. I mean, I used to live in Washington, D.C. back in the 90s. And I actually worked for the Department of Transportation. So
Oh, wow.
it's funny that you talked about that too. And back then, I met the author of a book about diversity and the workforce, building a more diverse workforce. This was 1993. Look how long it took for us to finally see progress. I mean, noticeable progress. That's a long time. So I'm prepared that's going to take time before we do that with accessibility and people with disabilities as well. All right, the next question is, a friend of mine, Rebecca Olin, just posted on YouTube. Yes, Meryl, too much is performative, not transformative. Excellent quote. I like that. And somebody else that's over in DC too. So, but I'm in Texas, by the way. I'm in Plano, Texas, but Washington, I lived there for 6 years. And no question for you. What impact might the increase in hybrid and remote work have on inclusive design effort? Ooh, I love this topic.
It's a question I thought a lot about, right? Because we've been making fits and starts of progress, as you said, going back to the early 90s, and we still have lots of work to go. But what we've seen over the last 2.5 years is if the world forces us to do something, we can actually make a lot of progress pretty quickly. You saw as we transitioned from largely working in offices to largely working, at least with knowledge workers, from remote locations at the beginning of the pandemic, that was a level of accommodation that people with disabilities have actually been asking for a very long time. And we saw that, the world didn't end when we allowed ourselves to work either remotely or in a hybrid way. That said, I think there's some things that we need to think about, particularly when it comes to these hybrid situations. Are certain communities that might take more advantage of remote work going to be at a disadvantage when it comes to performance reviews? Are folks who have additional caregiving responsibilities at home, you think about the people who might be more inclined to take advantage of remote work in a hybrid situation, people with disabilities, women who have additional caregiving opportunities, people of color who just don't want to deal with the constant onslaught of microaggressions. They might stay home. And I love the flexibility that they have to stay home and work just as well from wherever suits them. But what I don't want to happen is for it to become a two-tiered system of performance reviews or opportunities, right? If you're not in the office, does that mean you don't get as much face time with a more senior person in the company? Are they going to hold that against you as they're thinking about promotions and raises? Or when they say, hey, let's get a drink after work. Well, if I live 2,500 miles away, am I going to be hurt because I can't have that social interaction? So I think the answer to what this is going to look like still remains a pretty open question. But I would just say that I think we all have a responsibility to bring as much thoughtfulness as we possibly can to making sure that we don't just change the way inequities have always existed and place them in a slightly different hierarchy with in-person work and remote work, and then that we make sure that we're adjusting for the ways in which some marginalized communities might be best equipped to do their best work, but we shouldn't make sure that that's not held against them when it comes to how well they're able to thrive and grow in their career. So I think open question, but my hope is we're thoughtful enough early in the stages of building out what these hybrid models look like, such that we don't increase some of the inequities that have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah, that's food for thought. And remote, the big word we're going to be hearing a lot of is proximity bias.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure you've heard that, because if you're not there, people won't think of you. I've been a remote worker since 2005, and I could not think of going back. Yeah. And it was my hope the pandemic would change companies' minds when they have 2 years to see remote working works. You don't need to micromanage people. And a lot of people do the best work in their own comfortable environment because they can set it however they want. They're not dealing with the noise. They're not dealing with lighting issues. And of course, some people with disabilities are finding it somewhat easier and less time consuming than trying to deal with transportation.
Exactly.
Because, yeah, so Thomas Chevrolet is not accessible. Okay, so we've come up to the time, so I'm doing what they asked us to do is to cut it right here. So thank you. You were fabulous, Malcolm, and I'm so glad I got to meet you and chat with you. So our official ID host, take over.
Thank you, Meryl. And thank you, Malcolm. What a great talk and great questions, great discussion afterwards as well. Thank you. That was really fantastic. So if you liked this session, hit the YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to youtube.com/Inclusive Design 24 to be kept in the loop on our future events. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our supporters, Intopia, Fable, Barrier Break, TPGI, UX for the Win, Equal Entry, Infoaxia, Intuit, the Law Office of Laney Feingold, Adrian Roselli LLC, and WebAble. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with our next session, where Zora Cameron will be talking to us on the subject of performative equity and inclusion. We hope to see you then.